So here's something interesting. I find myself in Lesotho, a small mountainous kingdom that is entirely surrounded by South Africa. For context, I'm standing in Lesotho, but across that river is South Africa. Now, Lesotho is a country that has a very unique profile in terms of its population, its economy, and also its culture. But the thing is that Lesotho has been having a very interesting internal conversation. This conversation has been about them reclaiming land that was annexed by the Boer and the British republics from its territories roughly 140 years ago. The only issue with that, though, is that those republics don't exist anymore. And with time, lines on a map become permanent and also very much harder to redraw. Now, this ongoing debate to reclaim land from South Africa stems from them wanting the entire Free State, which is 130,000 square kilometers and is more than 4 times the size of the Lesotho kingdom. But it doesn't end there. There's another 4 parts that are connected to provinces that border Lesotho, which they also want as part of this claim. Large parts of the population in these areas that they're looking at are from the same Basotho nation, which also makes up almost 2 million people strong. In fact, there are around twice as many Basotho who live in South Africa, around 4 million people. Okay, for context, Lesotho has a population of roughly 2.3 million people. The vast majority, or around 99% of the people in Lesotho are Basotho. Lesotho also has a very young population. A significant portion of the population is under the age of 15, which is actually very typical of many developing nations. A significant portion of the population engages in subsistence agriculture. And also, the sector's contribution to GDP is relatively small. Lesotho has some diamond mining activity, which actually contributes to its export earnings. Because in 2023, Lesotho's diamond exports were worth 195 million US dollars, around 3.6 billion rand, which was roughly 23% of the country's total exports. This was an increase from 2022, when diamonds accounted for 19.1% of Lesotho's total exports. When we look at GDP, Lesotho's gross domestic product in 2023 was $2.21 billion. The average GDP per capita in Lesotho stood at around $950 per year, around 17,800 rand in 2023. For context, the average GDP per capita in South Africa is around 6,000 US dollars or 112,000 rand per year. Lesotho is small and its dependence is highly tied to South Africa's. They do have sectors like textile, water resources, and tourism plays a really big part in this. Now, there are often discussions about Basotho wanting their land back from South Africa. So in this piece, we're going to unpack the historical context that is behind these land claims. But I want us to be very sensitive because it's crucial that we understand this and become a little bit more understanding of the long history and who it involves, what it involves, and where we are now. See, modern day Lesotho is entirely surrounded by South Africa, as I've said. But this wasn't always the case. To understand the current situation, we have to go back to the 19th century, to the reign of King Moshoeshoe I. Moshoeshoe was a pretty brilliant diplomat and strategist for his time. And his time was very tumultuous because it was during the Mfecane period, which was a widespread time of conflict as well as migration in Southern Africa. Moshoeshoe united various Basotho groups and established a very strong kingdom within these mountains. And luckily for him, this place with its mountains is pretty much impenetrable territory if you're looking at it from natural military defenses. Moshoeshoe's kingdom extended far beyond present-day borders, and it very much included the very fertile lowlands to the west and to the northern areas. These parts are now part of South Africa. However, this expansion brought with it conflict with the Boer settlers, the Afrikaners. They were also moving into the region. These land disputes led to a series of wars during the mid-1800s known as the Basotho-Boer Wars. Under Moshoeshoe's leadership, the Basotho put up a fierce resistance, and there was no way for the Boers and the Basotho, as well as the British, other than to settle. Crucially, to preserve his nation's independence, Moshoeshoe appealed for British protection. Yes, those borderline drawers, the British, they're also involved here. So in 1868, Basotholand, as it was known then, became a British protectorate. Now this intervention prevented complete annexation of Basotho territory by the Boers. or at least it stopped the conflict through a lot of compromises. There was one treaty in particular that was signed, and this kind of gives us the perspective about what we're dealing with today. When Lesotho became independent in this way, the result was that it had to give away a lot of land. That treaty was the Treaty of Alel North, which was signed in 1869 between the British and the Boers. Strange thing is, they don't mention it being signed by Basotho people. This was a new establishment of borders and a new Basotho land, the same place which is now called Lesotho. The treaty defined the borders of Basotho land, which were now very much more reduced. This was Moshoeshoe's new kingdom, but it had been cut in half. Now, the result at the time was that the treaty ended any armed conflict between the Free State and the Basotho, but it left a sting in the mouths of Basotho people. But there were even larger consequences. Basotho land was annexed from the Cape Colony in 1871. In 1884, it became a separate British protectorate finally, through various treaties, some of them with legal grounds, some of them not so much. Larger and larger portions of Basotho territory was incorporated into what we now eventually know as South Africa. This is the core of the historical grievances around the land issue with Lesotho and South Africa. The fertile lowlands were crucial for agriculture, and they still very much are. These were lost in those treaties. Basotho land gained its independence from the British in 1966, and that's actually when it was renamed into being Lesotho, land of the Sotho people. It's very important for us to understand that these land losses are a source of deep historical and economic trauma for many Basotho. They represent a loss of not just land, but also resources, cultural heritage, and the sense of historical injustice. Today, the border between Lesotho and South Africa is internationally recognized. While there are still discussions and occasional calls for the return of the lost land, it's crucial to emphasize that any resolution must be sought through peaceful means, dialogue, and diplomatic channels. So where are we now in all of this? Well, in March of 2023, Lesotho legislators started to debate a motion that proposed the reclaiming of large parts of South African land, parts that they believe are parts that belong to Lesotho. The parliamentary debate was subsequently adjourned and for a long time has been awaiting executive action. Some say it's already failed, some say it's important for Basotho. The motion was brought by Tsepo Lipolo, a minor opposition leader who occupies a position within the Basotho Convenient movement. And they only really have one seat out of a 120-seat parliament. He was quoted as saying that history has a record of what was taken from our people, and that people were killed in the process. It's time to correct that. That's what he told Parliament. It's also time for what is ours to be returned to us. These were some of his sentiments. So could this land reclamation by Lesotho ever actually become a real thing? Well, most experts actually believe that this is unlikely. The motion to return land is gaining some support though inside Lesotho, even though it is isolated. Based off a newer August 2024 Afrobarometer survey, it seems that a larger than expected majority of Basotho actually want their government to do all it can to at least start the conversation around reclaiming territories that were lost by Lesotho to South Africa during the colonial era. Key findings from this 1,200 people survey actually show that 7 in 10 Basotho, 71%, say that their government should be doing all it can to reclaim the territories. This number actually includes 61% who strongly agree with this idea. The support for the return of the land is more pronounced amongst rural and peri-urban residents than among the urban counterparts, 78 to 75% rural versus 61% urban. Fewer than half, 45% of adults with post-secondary education actually endorse this view, compared to more than 7 in 10 respondents with lower educational attainment, who come in at around 72 to 76%. The Lesotho versus South Africa land dispute does, however, find itself in conversations periodically as a talking point in parliament and within political campaigns. It doesn't appear to have a majority within parliament though, and that's what's necessary in order for it to become law and for action to be taken from the Lesotho side. The other very important fact which could be debated here on its own is that in 1964, the Cairo Declaration by the Organization of African Unity, which is actually now the African Union, got African leaders to agree that the newly independent countries would recognize the borders that were inherited from colonial powers. This was so that they could avoid stirring future conflicts amongst each other. South Africa has a very strong case to actually reject Lesotho's claim to its land. For instance, Eswatini's King Mswati III has in the past similarly given claims like this, where he says that big parcels of neighboring South African land were historically part of his kingdom and they should be returned as well. But he's never really realized any of these claims into anything concrete. Then, on top of all of this land reclamation talk, there is another faction in Lesotho. This faction wants a different thing altogether. In 2018, a civil group known as the Free Basotho Movement actually wrote to the Lesotho's UK embassy to request that the late Queen Elizabeth remove the current frontier, or actually essentially trying to make Lesotho a 10th province of South Africa. They were doing this because they wanted passports scrapped, and they said that it would also ensure that the movement of the Basotho people in South Africa would be freer, and they would also get the perks that come with the South African national flag. But yeah, while this debate goes back and forth, many Basotho still live under really tough circumstances and conditions. So what should the Lesotho government be prioritizing right now? Actually, since you made it this far into the video, I'd like to know what you think about this issue. What should happen here? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for watching this video up until this point. We hope it was as interesting for you to watch as it was for us to make. Check out one of these other videos and hopefully they'll be just as interesting as this one. Cheers.